His name is a byword for foolish greed and fantastic wealth. According to legend, he yearned to be the richest man in the ancient world, and it brought him only misery. But was King Midas, the man who turned everything he touched to gold, just a myth? Or was this storybook king, the man behind the Midas touch, for real? In 1957, a spectacular discovery was made on a desolate plain in central Turkey. It would go to the heart of the ancient world and of the Midas legend. Buried deep in a huge mound was the skeleton of what seemed to be a powerful ruler.
It was exciting because of the beautiful stuff that he had. Furniture, collapsed tables, it was gorgeous.
The legend began to be explored. And now an astonishing picture is emerging of a long-lost and fabulously rich civilization, of brilliantly successful kings who built a city finer in its time than anything in Greece itself, and of a mysterious land where the Midas touch began and where it is finally being unraveled. As early as 650 BC, Greek poets began to use the name of Midas to stand for great wealth. And then, over the coming centuries, Greek plays and Roman verse built up the myths we are familiar with today. The greatest of these is the tale of Midas's golden touch.
Midas had saved the life of a servant of Dionysus, the god of wine. In return, he asked Dionysus for one favor. Grant that whatsoever I may touch with my body may be turned to yellow gold. Dionysus granted him his wish, but no sooner had Midas started to revel in his new talent than he fell into despair. For whatever he touched did at once turn to gold. Soon Midas found himself starving, and he pleaded for help. Have mercy, I pray thee. Save me from this curse that seemed so fair. Dionysus was generous and told Midas that he could return to his old self once he had bathed in the river Pactolus, whose sands have been golden ever since.
But asking for the golden touch was not Midas's only act of folly. There was a second myth about him, every bit as mocking as the first.
Midas was asked to judge whose music was the more beautiful, Apollo's or Pan's. Midas chose Pan. Then Apollo angrily said to Midas, "You will have ears to match the mind you have in judging." And with these words, he caused him to have ass's ears.
But as well as the Midas of myth, there was a Midas who was mentioned by ancient historians as a real person. The references are few and tantalizing, and they seem to paint a very different picture from the mythical fool. Instead, they talk about a mighty king who ruled part of modern Turkey, then called Phrygia, around 700 BC, and had his court in a city called Gordium. This King Midas of history first crops up in tablets written in the late 8th century BC by the king of Assyria, Phrygia's neighbor to the east.
A messenger of Midas the Phrygian has come to me. This is extremely good. The Phrygian has given us his word and become our ally.
Then in the 5th century BC, the Greek historian, Herodotus, also mentions Midas.
Midas, king of Phrygia, dedicated his royal throne to the oracle at Delphi. And this indeed is a marvel to see.
These writings seem to hint at a sophisticated and diplomatic king, keen to make alliances with his neighbors. But then a later Greek writer suggested it all ended in a horrible death.
The Cimmerians burst into Phrygia when, according to report, Midas came to his death by drinking bull's blood.
As the ancient world gave way to the modern, these mentions were so small that no one could be sure Midas had really existed. After all, ancient historians were notoriously unreliable. Herodotus himself was known not only as the father of history, but also the father of lies. And there was no physical evidence to go on. No Phrygian objects of the period, no remains you could see and touch. So what was the truth? Did the Midas of myth have anything to do with a real person called Midas? The mystery would last for nearly 2,000 years, until a lone British Army officer stumbled on an astounding sight he could scarcely believe. For 2,000 years, King Midas seemed to have been a figure of legend, a fantasy of the Greek imagination. But in 1800, all that changed. While the Napoleonic Wars raged in Europe, a British soldier, Captain William Leake, was crossing Asia Minor on horseback, disguised as a Turkish Tartar. Along the route, Leake strayed into a valley called Doganlu. Towering above him were the ancient rocks of Phrygia. Suddenly, he stumbled on what looked like the entrance to a tomb. This, he knew, was a unique monument of great antiquity. As he approached, he realized that the tomb entrance was fake, designed to look like a doorway into a building, but in fact no more than an elaborate facade. High above him was an inscription in a strange and utterly unknown antique language. But two words resembled Greek, which Leake had studied.
Of all the words, the second and fourth of the above inscription are the most remarkable. They run Mide Phanakti, or for King Midas.
Before Leake's momentous discovery, the only suggestion of a real Midas had come from the classical writers. But here was a monument clearly dedicated to the fabled king. Leake's discovery changed the whole course of historical inquiry.
That was the first time people could lend some kind of substance to this figure Midas we had heard about in ancient classical sources.
Excitement grew about the possibility that the real Midas might be buried somewhere nearby. But in the end, all Leake had found was writing on a rock. There was no tomb to enter, no door to push open, no tunnel to excavate. It was nearly a century before any more clues were found. But then, in 1900, two German archaeologists, the Curter brothers, made further amazing discoveries. They dug into several of the mounds dotting the Phrygian landscape 60 miles from Leake's monument. Inside, they found burial chambers with bodies. These tombs were never exactly in the middle because the Phrygians were determined that no one would ever find their dead kings. The largest mound defeated the Curters. They lacked the right digging equipment, but they did make one other discovery: the remains of Gordion, the ancient capital of Phrygia. These discoveries reawakened the world's interest in the real Midas. Leake had found an inscription, The Curters had revealed Phrygian tombs. Was it possible archaeologists were getting nearer to Midas himself? Then, in the 1950s, Rodney Young, an American archaeologist from the University of Pennsylvania, arrived on the scene. He was determined to achieve what the Curters had failed to do and discover the secret burial place of King Midas. And one burial mound stood above the rest.
Young felt that this was the biggest mound of all those mounds. This was the splendid mound. Midas was the most important king. The biggest tomb surely must be for King Midas.
Young set out to discover the secrets of what he called the Midas Mound. This was the moment when the riddle of Midas might at last be solved. Would the myth turn out to be based in reality? Would he have donkey's ears? Would there be gold? The Midas Mound was 50 meters high and 300 meters across. From the earlier excavations, it was obvious to Young that the burial chamber and its remains would not be in the middle. Ellen Kohler, now 85, was a member of Young's original archaeological team.
Rodney knew that it was not going to be an easy thing. The Curters in 1900 had thought about it and given up as an impossible task in 1900.
Unless someone knew exactly where the tomb was, one could spend one's life tunneling around like a mole rat in here trying to find the tomb with no success.
Now in 1950, Rodney said to himself, can we or can we not do it? He knew one thing that he kept in his head, and that was that he did not want to spoil the top. He did not want to cut from the top and wreck the view of what it once was.
For over 2 years, they drilled in several places on the top and burrowed down 40 meters. Finally, they hit rocks. Could they be the outer casing protecting the tomb? A team of Turkish miners was drafted in to help with the lengthy tunneling into the side of the mound. They worked 24 hours a day until they bored through the layer of rock. Young was getting increasingly anxious that the tomb's interior might have collapsed. Then, in front of them, there was what looked like a vast log cabin.
He hit huge round timbers, and he had to cut a hole in that, like a little window-shaped hole. And right on the other side of that are squared timbers with a little bit of gravel between the round and the squared timbers. And so he cut a window through the second wall, the second wooden wall, and stuck his arm in, and it was space, not stuff. He was so happy, I think he could have died on the spot, because it meant that everything was still in there and nothing had collapsed.
Young knew he was on the verge of making a hugely important discovery. There, lying on what looked like a great wooden bed made from a single cedar tree, was a body. It had not been seen for over 2,500 years. But it wasn't just the body that excited Young. There was also a wealth of grave goods laid around the tomb, all evidence that this was the burial place of an important ruler or a king.
It was exciting because of the beautiful stuff that he had. Furniture, collapsed tables, beautiful big bronze pots, and 3 cauldrons on stands, and inside the cauldrons were pots that had been filled with food for the king. And so I had to clean the food out of the pots and the pots out of the cauldron. That was the part I loved. Contact with the materials.
It was a wonderful collection. Animal-headed buckets, water jugs shaped like ducks, children's toys, including a little carving of a lion attacking a bull, curious religious figures, and scattered around the floor of the tomb, hundreds of delicate bronze brooches. The archaeologists then needed to know how old the tomb was. A sample of the timbers was sent away for dating. The results was something amazing, placing the date when the timbers were cut around 718 BC.
People shouldn't use the word unique too often, but it is unique. Of the tombs that have been excavated around Gordion, elsewhere, there is really nothing like it, nothing as large as it, and certainly nothing that has withstood the centuries the way this has. To the best of our knowledge, it is the oldest standing wooden structure in the world. And for its relative worth, I think it is up there with the tomb of Tutankhamun.
Sketches of the tomb show that, like the pharaohs and their pyramids, the Phrygians took every step to prevent the tomb being found or entered. Entire trees, 20 feet long, were dragged by horses to the site, and the tomb was then constructed as a massive wooden cube. Once the body was inside, the chamber was sealed with a pitched roof of logs and then buried deep in layers of rock and earth. But if the timbers belong to the late 8th century BC, who was this king? Was it possible Midas was a candidate? The bones were examined, and it became clear that he was a man of 60 or 65. He was small, probably no more than 5'2" or 5'3". But an important bit of evidence turned out not to be in the tomb itself, but in the ruins of the citadel of Gordion. In the layers of earth and deposits, they discovered a so-called destruction level, a 1.5 meter layer of burnt ash. It suggested that a huge fire had raged through the settlement, destroying everything in its path. At that time, the only destruction of the capital known to have taken place was when invaders from Eastern Europe, called the Cimmerians, attacked Phrygia. Greek historians said that had happened about 687 BC, precisely when Midas was said to have killed himself, unable to face captivity under the invaders. It seemed possible that the logs cut down a few years before might have been used to construct Midas's tomb. Having decided who they thought the occupant of the tomb was, the archaeologists then wanted to know as much as they could about this ancient king. They invited Richard Neve and John Prague at the University of Manchester to reconstruct a face for Midas. While studying the skull, they learned a lot about why he looked as he did.
He's a fairly well-built sort of male. It's quite gracile, it's quite slender, but not effeminate in any way. It doesn't appear to have the muscles that you would associate with an athlete or a warrior, just a rather sort of intellectual, academic type of physique I would suspect he had.
What Neve and Prague found particularly unusual were the shape of his skull and the line of his jaw. The bulge at the back of the skull they knew was due to binding of the head in infancy, a Phrygian tradition which they thought created a more beautiful and dignified profile. But the jaw was more puzzling.
One of the things that we noticed about the lower jaw was that the alveolar margin, so the setting of the lower teeth, made them point forward very sharply, which, and the reconstruction produces a rather sort of pouting lower lip. And we showed a cast of the lower jaw to a colleague in the dental hospital here. And having studied it, he said that he had seen this condition twice on patients in his professional career. It was two teenage girls who'd had riding accidents and had fallen so that they'd hit their faces and ended up with their teeth sticking out forward.
As well as the skeleton in the tomb, the archaeologists found remains of food and drink and furniture suitable for a banquet. They began to realize there had been some kind of ceremony for the king outside the tomb. It very much looked like a magnificent open-air feast had been held as part of the burial of a much respected and supremely significant ruler. But the discovery of the feast created a new puzzle. If Midas had killed himself during the Cimmerian invasion, was it really likely that under such circumstances a lavish funeral was laid on? Doubts began to set in. Was this really Midas? Then, in 2001, scientists made some startling discoveries. Brand new carbon dating techniques revealed that the destructive fire which had raged through Gordian had nothing to do with Midas's death. Instead, it had taken place over a century before, around 800 BC. Secondly, a new analysis of the tomb timbers showed that they were, in fact, cut around 740 BC. But this was not the year Midas died. It was the year classical writers said he'd come to the throne. The skeleton couldn't be Midas. But if it wasn't Midas, who was the great ruler in whose honor the feast was held? In addition to Midas, there is only one other Phrygian whose name has survived centuries. Midas's father, Gordius. If this year of the feast was when Midas became king, it was also when his father, Gordius, died. The body in the tomb had to be King Gordius. For the archaeologists, this was a breakthrough. It would enable them to rewrite the Phrygian story, a story of not one, but two great kings, of a long-lost civilization of huge wealth, and of a fantastic city at its heart. Something as great as Greece itself would become, but 300 years before. The story of Gordius and Midas began nearly 3,000 years ago. Even though the Phrygians have left us no literature, it's possible through archaeology to get a picture of what this extraordinary civilization looked like. Imagine this land in the year 1000 BC. There is grassland, fertile enough to support flocks of sheep and goats and grow a few cereals. It was here that a new people came. They were described as allies of Priam, the king of Troy, in his war against Greece. Then they migrated to Anatolia and established a new kingdom of Phrygia. They called their capital Gordian.
All around there is arable land that is very well suited for dry farming, for the production of grains in particular.
The pasture would be top-notch, and it really does look like the economy in general was a mixed agricultural economy based on the herding of sheep and goat and the growing of wheat and barley and pulses.
Equally important is its location for trade and transport. It's sitting on a major route that goes to the east, to the Bosphorus, another route that goes to the Black Sea. It's relatively easy to go to Ankara and to the south. So it certainly is on a major route of trade and transport.
Gordian quickly won a reputation as a hugely successful manufacturing and trading center.
They had a wide diversification of crafts, many of which were probably serving the palace. We have furniture making, including very elaborate inlaid wooden furniture. We have ivory carving, we have bronze production. So we know a fair amount about their material culture, and judging by that, Phrygian culture seems to be quite well advanced.
Over 2 centuries, the Phrygians established themselves as an affluent society. Then, around 800 BC, Gordian faced a terrible crisis. A huge fire.
The fire was so hot in places that it literally melted pottery. And ordinarily in antiquity, pottery is fired at 800, 900 degrees centigrade, so we had heats in excess of that.
Pots blew apart, and you'll find pieces of the same pot in different parts of the room. Some of the pots look like marshmallows. If you stick a marshmallow in a fire, you know how it looks when it chars. Well, that's how the pots look.
And throughout it all, no people. No one, so far as we know, lost their life as a result of the fire. One way or another, they got out.
Around the time of the fire, or soon after, a new king came to the Phrygian throne. His name was Gordius. Gordius was probably named after the capital city, but now it lay in ruins, ravaged by fire. Gordius set about rebuilding his citadel. The new capital rose from the ashen ruins of the old. This time, and for a very specific reason, Gordian would be huge and beautiful, the envy of the world, and particularly of Greece. In the centuries before the Phrygian story began, Greece had been the regional superpower. But after the Trojan War, Greece had gone into a decline, from which it was only now starting to emerge. And for Gordius, the rebuilding of Gordian was a chance to show the resurgent Greeks that Phrygians were not only their equals, but in fact, ahead of them.
The earliest monumental buildings of the Greeks pale in comparison with our monumental buildings, so that from the point of view of architectural and building technology, the Phrygians were quite in advance of the Greeks.
Gordius's new structure was a naked demonstration of political power, designed to show the known world that Gordius was still in control of his kingdom after the devastation of the fire. The palace area to the northeast had an open court, surrounded by Megara, rectangular buildings, each with an anteroom and a main hall. The floors would have been covered with detailed mosaics made of multicolored stones. It had all the characteristics of a major citadel belonging to a powerful ruler. It was heavily fortified, and showed very clearly that Gordius understood its strategic importance. Ken Sams has worked with his Turkish colleagues on reconstructing an idea of the massive stepped defense in front of the citadel.
We know that it went up to the base of that wall, that multicolored wall that we see there. And imagine that it went down to the level of the floodplain.
Yeah.
And so if this stepped bastion is going all the way down to the floodplain, I estimate that it has a total height of something around 20 meters, maybe somewhat more than that. So that from the distance, anyone coming here would have been looking at something very impressive. And if you're trying to attack this site, you have big steps to take, you have your weapons, you need to lean in to keep your balance, and all the time you're doing that, defenders from the upper ramparts could be pelting all kinds of things down on you. The message was, we are impregnable.
With Gordius's death in 740 BC, Midas inherited a kingdom and the huge building project of the Gordian citadel. But one of his first duties was to arrange the old king's funeral. The evidence is that religion and the afterlife were vitally important to the Phrygians, and they decorated their everyday objects with religious symbols. Of particular interest is a serving table with a large rosette sculpted on one side.
The rosette in the center of each of the serving stands is a symbol of the Phrygian goddess Matar. So it was pretty clear that the serving stands were meant to be replicas of a monument or a shrine to the goddess Matar.
Although very little is known about the religion Midas followed, he appears to have worshipped Matar as a mother goddess of fertility. She is usually seen standing in a doorway, a threshold of some kind, perhaps into the afterlife. And more often than not, she is accompanied by musicians, playing drums or lyres, or an ancient woodwind instrument looking like a double flute. For Midas, the magnificent funeral feast he provided for Gordius may have been an act of religious dedication designed to secure his father's passage into the afterlife. It was the highest tribute a son could pay to his royal father. In addition to its significance as a religious event, the feast provides an extraordinary insight into the Phrygian way of life. Pat McGovern specializes in the chemical analysis of ancient organic remains. At the time he was asked to examine the food and drink from the tomb, no one had yet attempted to reconstruct ancient foods from the chemical data. This was the cutting edge of experimental archaeology. McGovern was eager to give it a go.
This is the food residue, and as you'll notice, it has a lumpy, brownish look to it, almost like what you'd expect if a stew had congealed. This is the beverage, which, as you'll notice, has a very intense yellowish or even golden look to it, and is a much finer material than the clumpy food residue.
There was a lot to work with. 5.5 pounds of food, over a pound from the drinks. McGovern and his team were able to separate out the different compounds present in the remains. By matching up the compounds to examples they had of ancient and modern food and drink, they were able to identify the contents of the feast.
Our evidence showed a very homogeneous mixture of different ingredients suggesting a stew. And the stew would have been combined of barbecued sheep or goat and lentils, spiced with anise or fennel. And there were some peppery compounds too, so it really had a sharp tanginess to it. In the case of the beverage, what we came up with was a very strange kind of mixture, which a lot of people cringed when they first heard it. It was a mixture of a grape product, probably wine, with a honey product, which when it's fermented becomes mead, and then barley, which when fermented becomes barley beer. So you've got a beer, wine, mead combination.
These were Midas's first days in power. He not only inherited a kingdom of good food and wine, but also one of great technological sophistication. He turned out to be a highly successful monarch. He ruled for about 50 years, and above all, he seems to have been a diplomat. One example was his dealings with his powerful neighbor, the king of Assyria.
The Phrygian has given us his word and become our ally.
Midas also understood the wisdom of keeping in with Greece, emerging from its dark age into a hugely valuable trading partner.
Midas dedicated his royal throne to the oracle at Delphi.
We're told by Herodotus that Midas was the first foreigner to dedicate an offering at the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, and he dedicated, interestingly enough, a piece of furniture. The throne from which he gave judgment, Herodotus doesn't tell us what it looked like, unfortunately, but he said it was well worth seeing. So there was a fabulous piece of Phrygian furniture set up at one of the most important sanctuaries in Greece.
Today, this extraordinary little statuette, now called the Lion Tamer, is the visible evidence of Herodotus's account. It seems it adorned the arm of Midas's great throne. But what about the ass's ears and the gold? Is there anything in the archaeological finds that might help explain why the ancient poets and dramatists created the two great Midas myths?
You will have ears to match the mind you have in judging.
But could this mythical curse have a root in reality? John Prague and Richard Neve have a theory. They think it's possible Midas had what are called hairy pinnae, or thick hair around the ears.
The pinna is this part of the ear that can be moved, this cartilaginous and skinny part of the ear. And the hair grows actually from the border of the outer border of the helix, and it'll grow on the antihelix, which is the inner sort of eminence here. And you can get it growing all the way around the edge and becoming quite long. We believe that this is as good an explanation as you're likely to get.
As for the gold, there is one possibility.
Grant that whatsoever I may touch with my body may be turned to yellow gold.
Phrygian goods were sold all over the ancient world, and their bronze was said to be the finest ever seen. It was of such a quality, in fact, that they could fool visiting traders into thinking it was actually gold.
Greece is coming out of the Dark Ages, is coming out of a real major economic slump. There's contact now with these eastern kingdoms, like Phrygia, which are rich. And travellers are going to and fro, and they're coming back with stories about this incredible wealth. You know, the king out there, God, he's so rich. Everything he touches turns to gold.
You could easily imagine some Greek from, some rube from Greece, you know, comes into Anatolia and he sees in a shop, he sees really shiny metal. He's never seen anything quite so bright before. And he says to the shopkeeper, "Is that gold?" And the shopkeeper says, "Well, yes, it is. For you, special price." And that you could imagine how that would then get translated. Now, I don't know if that's what actually happened, but that's what I like to think of as the source of the golden Midas connection.
But the tragedy of Midas was his death. Despite his great wealth and trading skills, despite his diplomacy, it seems that he died when Phrygia was invaded by a new people, Cimmerians. With them, Midas had neither the time nor the chance to use his talent for peacemaking.
Midas came to his death by drinking bull's blood.
But the bull's blood story presents a final puzzle, which John Prague and Richard Neve believe they have now resolved.
Bull's blood is non-toxic.
But bull's blood appears surprisingly often in antiquity, particularly in Greek history, as a means of, usually of killing oneself, rather than poisoning somebody else. And this doesn't really make sense, because there are African tribes who drink blood rather than milk as a product from their cattle. And I like a good black pudding. I mean, that tradition of eating blood puddings is very old. And we could only decide that this must have been blood that had been left, say, for a day in a hot climate. It'll develop a botulism, and then it will become very rapidly very poisonous.
So there can be no final certainty. Did Midas deliberately allow the bull's blood to turn to poison and use it for suicide? Or was it death by accidental poisoning? Neither form of death can diminish Midas's stature as a king who reigned for more than half a century. Midas ruled over a long-lost civilization which is at last being given the respect and attention it deserves by the achievements of modern science and archaeology. But why then did the Greeks turn Midas into the fool of the myths? Until the new discoveries at Gordian, our image of Midas was encrusted with myth. The golden touch, the ass's ears he got from Apollo. What's clear from these myths is that the Greeks were determined to make Midas look foolish. We know from the rock face Leek discovered that the Phrygians had their own written language, yet only tiny fragments have survived, and even today, it has not yet been decoded. There were also their sophisticated geometric patterns, suggesting a people of great intelligence.
When one looks more closely at the Phrygian geometric designs, one discovers these incredible hidden meanings and hidden puzzles, and an understanding of mathematics, geometry, logic. They were actually much more sophisticated than we are today.
Because their own writings did not survive, it was the Phrygians' bad luck that the picture that came down the centuries was created by Greek historians. And those Greeks had an ulterior motive.
By the classical period, so the 5th century BC, the whole picture of the Phrygians has actually changed in Greek eyes. And they are no longer these rich and powerful people. They are becoming figures of fun. No longer is Phrygia a source of wealth, it's a source of slaves. And the change in how they saw Midas, I think, has to be seen in that sort of setting.
The Phrygian civilization lingered on after the triumphal years of Gordius and Midas. And once again, its last famous act is bound up with myth. The story of the famous Gordian knot.
Gordias lashed the pole and yoke of his chariot together, and let it be known that whoever could undo the knot would become ruler of all Asia.
Many tried, but 400 years later, the knot was still tied fast. Then, around 350 BC, Alexander the Great passed through Phrygia on his all-conquering journey east, and in his own unique way, he solved the mystery of the Gordian knot.
He had a go at the knot, apparently got very impatient, fed up with it, took out his sword and simply sliced it in half. And Alexander does go on to become the master of Asia, but he dies in his early 30s in Babylon. And so sages saw Alexander's short life as stemming from what happened here at Gordion.
The Phrygians were eventually wiped out in the 2nd century BC, and their two great kings, Gordius and Midas, quietly slipped out of history and into myth for 2,000 years. Today, the ruins of the Phrygian capital, Gordion, are revealing more and more of the truth behind those myths and the civilization which gave rise to them. And perhaps, one day soon, a tomb will be opened and the body of the real King Midas himself will be finally revealed.